Majyūō, or however it's pronounced, is a 1995 Super Famicom exclusive developed by Nihon Soft System and released by KSS in Japan. King of Demons is the translation, so we're gonna go ahead with that title from here on out. This is a game I've wanted to cover for some time now. In it, you take control of Abel, who is on the search for his wife and daughter. From what I can surmise from this opening playable sequence, they've both been dragged to hell, so it's up to 80s blue jeans here to go save them. There's some dialogue at the beginning with a cutesy illustration of your family that doesn't really fit the tone of the game, but I don't speak or read Japanese, so I don't understand the intricacies of the narrative. What in the hell is your kid holding? A bat? A cat? A marsupial? Is that its tail or a massive dong? Either way, the story isn't all that important. This is an action game, and you play as this guy. Bing, bang, boom. First things first, the visuals are absolutely beautiful here. King of Demons really takes advantage of the hardware with its vibrant color palette, impressive scaling, and rotation effects, as well as its use of Mode fucking 7, because there's gotta be some Mode 7, baby. Your protagonist is relatively small on the screen, but it works because there are a lot of huge bosses to come up against. The tiny sprite size makes it easier to dodge incoming attacks and obstacles. It's also nice to have an unobstructed view of the environments and effects going on in the background. There's quite a bit of parallax scrolling throughout the game's limited stages, and the areas change frequently throughout to keep things fresh. A lot of people compared this thing to the Castlevania series, but I honestly don't see it. Sure, they're both horror themed, but stylistically, it's an apples and oranges sort of deal. To me, it's like comparing a Universal or Hammer flick to a slasher. King of Demons would fit into the latter category, with its buckets of blood approach to the genre. It's violently visceral in the way it depicts its gore, with enemies and bosses that become dismembered with each offensive attack. Great stuff, 10 out of 10. This is a goddamn bloodbath at times, and I approve. The big bads are the stars of the show here. A lot of stages feel like boss rushes with brief run and gun sequences sprinkled throughout to fill the gaps. It's all about moving right and blasting away at lesser enemies from point A to B until the next huge encounter. This can often make the action feel rather basic, despite how varied and lush the environments are. Yes, there are a few gimmicks tossed in to break up the monotony, such as this gigantic icy whale obstruction and the first stage's elevator sequence, but for the most part, this is a linear affair. It's a good thing the bosses are so great, because otherwise, this would be a pretty middling, forgettable experience. At the end of each stage, the final baddie drops a gigantic egg-shaped jewel. Now listen up, because this is where things get a bit complicated, alright? So, these things plop out and can be absorbed to alter Abel's form. There are a variety of different beasts to transform into. The orb changes color if it's left alone for a few seconds, which would have been nice to know on my first handful of playthroughs. Basically, there are a few options here, but there are also 3 stronger versions of each transformation if you continuously hit the same color. Each form is loosely based off of the boss from which it is dropped, and all of them are useful in their own specific ways. You can get through the game as Abel if you wish to ignore the orbs, and it might even give you a different ending, but I wouldn't know because I enjoy using these alternate forms way too much to stick with the Denim Demon Destroyer. It's a fun way of encouraging new strategies upon subsequent playthroughs, and this game is pretty short, so it's a great way to get your money's worth. Throughout the stages, there are blue orbs that replenish Abel's health, and a nude fairy, who I assume is supposed to be your wife's spirit. She appears infrequently to offer some assistance. This chick is a teeny tiny powerhouse who flies around firing at enemies. If you die while she's buzzing about, she'll sacrifice her life to give you another shot. Kick the bucket without her and it's back to a checkpoint to try again. Unless you're in the last stage. I'm going to show a few endgame spoilers here, you've been warned. So you're basically expected to plow through a bunch of mini bosses back to back in this final area without checkpoints. If you don't have the most powerful form, it can be a real slog. Personally, I can't stand endgame boss rushes in general, and this one's particularly unforgiving due to the lack of respawn points or health orbs. You pretty much have to learn how to master taking out all of these menacing monsters without losing too much life. In between them are some tiny pixie launchers, but feasting on their flesh only revives a bit of energy. And yes, you heard what I said. You can shoot fairies down to tear them to shreds throughout the entire game. It's as good as it sounds, and the animation is great. Knowing how to do this is important because your life bar drains extremely quickly, and it doesn't refill between stages unless you've changed into a new form. It's possible to gradually permanently lengthen Abel's life bar with each 5,000 points obtained through combat, and a 1-up is rewarded at 10,000. Honestly, this isn't a very challenging game if you know what you're doing and can get used to the slightly stiff controls. Your character isn't all that maneuverable in the air, and his movements can take a few moments to adjust to. For these reasons, the action always reminds me a bit of ActRaiser on the SNES. He's a bit floaty and you'll need to be deliberate in your movements, but the enemies and stage designs all complement his abilities. The forms follow the same basic mechanics. You can walk, jump, double jump, kick downwards when in mid-air, shoot, do a powered-up attack, and dodge. Most of the time your evasive maneuver is a roll, but there are some variants such as this teleporting demon move. It's all about timing and feels like an arcade game, which I really like. All of the bosses have well-choreographed attacks that are extremely rewarding to learn. Some have multiple forms with great animations that make them an absolute blast to take down. Have I mentioned how much I enjoy the big bads in this game? The time limit can get a bit tight at times, but it does add a little extra after every big encounter, which is generous. Still, I've found myself dying to it a lot, so it's best to keep things moving. Hiroshi Iizuka and Tomohiro Onrei's soundtrack is outstanding, with some great atmospheric numbers as well as a hefty amount of guitar-led butt rock pieces. Unfortunately, the sound effects are often grating and overpower a lot of the music. This form in particular has a boomerang attack that is very shrill. There is no way to adjust the volume, as there are no options at all for this game. Still, the soundtrack is interesting and varied, so it deserves some credit. We've covered it in more detail in our 16-bit horror music episode of VGM 101, so check it out there if you'd like. Bottom line, it's a bit wacky, but it suits the game very well. Yeah, so there's really not a hell of a lot more to say about King of Demons. It's a pretty straightforward action game with killer boss battles, incredibly drawn visuals, and a rockin' soundtrack. This is one of the rarest titles for the Super Famicom, but I managed to find a reproduction cart a few years ago at a local shop. It wasn't exactly cheap either, so I definitely encourage you guys to find a less than wholesome way of experiencing it. The game isn't all that long or challenging, but it more than makes up for those things with its arcade-like controls and replay value. I give it a spin quite frequently, and can't recommend it enough. It's good fun. Next time on this channel, something completely different. So stay tuned.